first of all, let me just put my comments in some kind of context. I'm painfully aware that the theme of this conference is rather more historical than contemporary, has a wide reach, and it also has a wide geographical reach as well, wide chronological and geographical reach. As you might imagine, as a Brit, we are at the moment where Europe is concerned, much more concerned with contemporary problems than we are with far-flung historical or geographical ones. So please forgive me if I focus my comments on what I call more immediate challenges, and as the rector has said, possibly challenges leading to a crisis in the development of the European idea. We're celebrating in the UK at the moment the 400th anniversary of William Shakespeare's death. And it might be, therefore, useful to start with a quotation from him that perhaps sets the scene for the comments I want to make in my paper. In his great history play, Richard II, he invites the audience to sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Now, what he means by this metaphor is a reflection on the mutability of public power. Kings die, regimes fall, empires wither. My reflections here are really addressed to the future of the European Union as an imperial construction. Is it merely facing challenges which might be resolved and overcome, or is it facing a cumulative crisis that might well lead to its own demise? Before we address that question, let me start with a more happier prospect. We all know the successes of the European idea, a remarkable legacy of achievements and a number of important victories to its credit over the years since the cataclysm of what Winston Churchill called the Great European Civil War. The integration of historic enemies, particularly France and Germany, which of course is what the coal and steel community was primarily all about. The building of common institutions, the taming of xenophobic nationalism, economic reconstruction and the building of what was a common market and is now a single European market. Political instability that has embedded in Europe a liberal and democratic political culture, recently extended beyond the boundaries of the old Western Europe, further east and south. And of course, also the European Union's development as an internationally credible force in global politics. They are pretty significant achievements, but are those achievements now being threatened by recent developments? There are many people who have argued that this is indeed the case. I heard the great French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy speaking in a BBC program not 2 weeks ago, where he said, and I quote, "The European idea is at the very least in crisis and maybe even dying." Now, from that source, that is a pretty important indictment. And his argument went something like this. I can only summarize what was a very erudite and lengthy presentation. But he basically said this, that the European idea has stagnated. Its historical roots in a generation that had faced warfare and conflict have paled as the successive generations have taken for granted its achievements. We have become complacent. And he said, it isn't just the skeptics who are antagonistic to the European idea, but some of the people who are its most important advocates are also culpable of neglecting the meaning of the European idea. He made an argument which I have only recently started to take on board and think about, and I think it's an argument that we should all consider, that European integration has become a kind of teleology, almost an ideological force, a bit like Marxism. You just have to keep plugging on and eventually you get to the end state. The idea that ever closer union more or less wrote its own script. We didn't have to work hard to save it. We didn't have to keep reinventing it. Now, he said, and I agree with him, I've never been in the least bit attracted, even as a radical student of the 1960s, with Marxist ideas. But he said there is a positivist fallacy in certain kinds of ways of looking at history. And he said that the European idea has strayed into that kind of territory. The Kantian ideal, Enlightenment values as a mobilizing force for action after the Second World War, have been replaced by a kind of view of the European project that was rooted in that rather silly idea of Fukuyama at the time of the end of the Cold War, that we have reached the end of history. The West has won, end of story. Well, of course, as Levy said, history has no teleology. It's mutable, the point that Shakespeare was making in that quote. It moves back and forth, it moves up and down, and it has to be constantly revisited and reinvented. So, how then do we gauge the extent of the crisis? In my paper, and it's a fairly long paper, I only really have time to summarize some of the major arguments, but in my paper I ask a number of questions about the current challenges that are facing the European project. Are these challenges presaging, pointing towards a European crisis? And if so, how might this crisis be addressed? Secondly, are we really witnessing the unraveling of Europe as we have known it, or as we have assumed it to be for the past 70 years? Are these challenges merely periodic blips in the progress towards ever closer union, or are they something more structural and corrosive? And thirdly, since it's my belief that these challenges all point to a failure of what I call the European Union's polity process, failure of its governance, in many ways the failure of its current elites, how will the European Union, how can the European Union recover and reconnect with its own anxious and disaffected citizens? These are the sorts of questions that I want to look at briefly in a review of the challenges before I get down to what I think are the really critical points that are to do with how we revise and reform and reimagine the European idea and its institutions. I'm almost spoilt for choice when I look at the list of challenges. Do we begin with what I call insurgent or populist politics? Is the real threat from British exit? Or is it about migration and the whole debate about Schengen and a borderless Europe? We could pick any one of those topics and argue that it is of great significance for the future of the European project. I want to start basically, if you like, tossing a coin. It's not quite tossing a coin, but this is the crisis that we are most, or the challenge that we're most concerned with at the moment, with the migration challenge. Leonard Doyle, who is the head of the International Organization for Migration, said 3 weeks ago, the migration crisis has rocked Europe to its very foundations. Another commentator, the Financial Times lead writer Peter Spiegel, said about the same time, how can you protect your national borders when your actual and practicable borders are in Greece? Hundreds of miles of unpatrolled islands, capes, promontories, inlets, littorals, etc. He wasn't making a negative comment about the Greeks. He was simply making a point about the difficulty of having a border in such a geographically unfriendly region. What we've seen with the migration crisis is a mixture of hope and despair. The generosity, if we call it that, of Mrs. Merkel's willingness to take more than Germany's share of Syrian refugees. On the other hand, the less seemly spectacle of the Hungarian Prime Minister using xenophobic language to justify the building of razor wire fences and even the use of tear gas against migrants trying to progress on their way north. What we've seen in the migration crisis, I think, in many ways is an epitome of Europe's problems. an unseemly scramble. Do-it-yourself borders going up, almost, there was a period, the end of last year where borders were almost going up on a do-it-yourself basis. States responding to other states by putting their own razor wire fences in place. The European Union itself didn't respond. You could say, to again quote, if you like, Winston Churchill, this was not our finest hour. We let Greece, and to a lesser extent Italy, we tend to forget Italy was there first with migrants coming across the Lampedusa from the Maghreb. We have let Greece, and to a lesser extent Italy, bear the brunt of those spectacular migration patterns. We put in place what we think is a sticking plaster solution, the so-called Dublin Plus proposal, where migrants claim asylum status in the place they first land, but with this correction mechanism now where some of them can claim asylum in places further into the European Union from the one they first landed in. Even that process has failed. I contacted the British Home Office and I asked for statistics about how many migrants had actually been settled under this process. And after much prevarication, I was told that 937 people were resettled under the Dublin Plus arrangements in the first 6 months of the scheme's operation. When you think of the millions of people that are involved in this process, this is hardly spectacular. Dimitris Avramopoulos, the commissioner in charge of EU asylum rules, blames the member states for their lack of political will. That's a direct quotation, their lack of political will. And he's absolutely right. Of course, there has been a lack of political will. What we've got in response to the migrant crisis is the famous, or if you prefer it, infamous Turkish deal. A Liberal MEP in the European Parliament described it quite rightly in a debate a few weeks ago as a typical EU fudge. Expecting the Turks to process migrants, to repatriate them and to send in their place migrants who are already settled in Turkey but have not tried illegally to enter EU territory. Even that process has been a lamentable failure. Frontex, and these are not my words, they are the words of a European commissioner, is not fit for purpose. There should be 4,000 officials minimum in Greece managing this project. There should be much greater funds than have been directed at this project of managing the Turkish border crossings. And there's been very little evidence of anything more than 40% of that number of Frontex officials on the ground, and with member states reluctant to even pay for that. Secondly, the fact that we are using Turkey, if you like, as a conduit for Europe's problems. I'm sure you know there was a debate in the European Parliament yesterday, and the former Belgian Prime Minister and leading member of the Liberal group was almost apoplectic in his condemnation of the use of Turkey as the solution for the EU's migration problems. A state, he said, that has no fundamental commitment to human rights, doesn't even have any human rights law, that is clearly using the migration crisis, the Erdogan government, as a way of strutting their stuff and getting easy access for Turks to visa and possibly even full accession of the European Union. This is a rather sordid deal that I think many people on all sides of the European Union and all sides of party politics in the European Parliament have argued is less than satisfactory. Is this the best that a European Union full of some of the brightest and best public officials in the world, with the commitment that we have to fundamental human rights values, can do in the face of what is a major crisis? Now, you may ask, well, what's your solution? I'm not paid to provide solutions to these sorts of problems. We can all think of off-the-cuff solutions, but it is the responsibility of the European Union and its institutions to deal with these crises. And I think that anybody, even with the most fundamental commitment to the European idea, would say that this is not what has been happening. If I could mention, before I move on to my second crisis, what I call a flanking issue. I think one of the problems, and I'm aware that I'm speaking in Berlin and I'm a guest, if you like, of the German people, but I don't think Mrs. Merkel has covered herself with glory over the way this Turkish deal was done. I only have no documents are available. It's a relatively recent development. But talking to senior journalists in newspapers in London who I know have told me that this was basically a deal worked out with Mrs. Merkel and with a little bit of help from the Dutch foreign minister, without any real consultation with the other member states. Something as important as this. And it seems to me that this says something too about a larger problem in the European Union. I must be careful which particular adjective I use here, but German hegemony, German dominance, that there is a kind of mentality amongst some German officials and some German politicians that they are the surrogate leaders of the European Union. Now, I'm not criticizing Germany in any fundamental sense. They are the major paymasters. They have been the major engine of economic growth. They have been the major force since 1945 in pushing the European idea. But a European Union that depends on the hegemony of one particular country, which largely takes for granted the consent of the other members of the community, I think is a bad way of constructing a community of equals. I'm just reminded here very briefly of American hegemony. We all know the failings of NATO. We all know that one of the fundamental problems with NATO was the indifference and almost aloofness of the Americans with regard to its partners in that institution. And we know the consequences of that have been the undermining and weakening of NATO. So what I'm saying here then is that the migration crisis points to a problem in the political dynamics of the Union which needs to be fundamentally addressed. No criticism of Germany's contribution to the solution of the migrant crisis. You might say that if other member states had stepped up to the plate, taken their share earlier, Mrs. Merkel would not have been forced to make that kind of almost unilateral decision. But it is a problem, and I think it adds to the perception amongst many people in all parts of the Union that this isn't a European Union, but in many ways it's a union that is largely dominated by German self-interest, or German, at least, national interests. Okay, the second problem, which of course follows on very clearly from the first one. This isn't just a migration crisis. This has sparked a huge debate in the European Union about borders, the borders issue. The demise, it was mentioned in some of the presentations before coffee, the demise of Schengen. Ad hoc borders going up everywhere, the use of a language which we have not seen in Europe since before the Second World War. So this raises the question of whether or not Schengen is over and done with. Can Schengen be salvaged after this kind of onslaught on its fundamental premises? And you may say, well, you're a Brit, so you would say this, but I don't think that the future of the European idea necessarily depends on a borderless Europe as encapsulated by the Schengen Agreement. The UK is not in the Schengen zone. It is possible to have national borders. We have passport controls. It is still possible to have those things. I'm not sure I would make a fetish out of a borderless Europe. I think that the demise of Schengen may well be something that is a challenge for the European Union, but I don't think it is a deal breaker. I'm not, and as I said, that may well be because I'm a Brit and I see these things from a rather different perspective than people who are used to not showing their passports when they cross borders. So there is a potential challenge which I don't think adds to the crisis of the European project. My third crisis, or rather my third challenge, is one that, of course, has been heightened by the migrant crisis, but I don't think has been caused by it. And this is the rise of insurgent politics, populist or far-right or neo-right-wing movements all over the European Union. Comments have been made. Somebody made a comment in one of the presentations this morning that, you know, this is somehow an evil that we have to root out, and so it is. But I think we also have to, if we're addressing this in inverted commas, evil, we have to look at the causes of it. I'm finishing for my sins at the moment a large book on the whole question of Euroscepticism. The subtitle of the book is The Crisis, Euroscepticism and the Crisis of Liberal Politics. I think Euroscepticism underlines this crisis of liberal politics. Let me briefly quote, I'm sure you've heard of this guy, and I'm sure some of you will have read his books, but Peter Mayer, the late Peter Mayer, Irishman, educated at Oxford, professor of politics at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. His last book before he died, in fact, they had to retrieve it from his computer. He hadn't even finished it and sent it to the publishers, was entitled Ruling the Void, the Hollowing Out of Western Democracy. And his premise is basically this, summarized 300 pages in a couple of sentences. European elites, he said, have, at both the national and at the European level, of vacating the agora. They're leaving the public square. We've seen the corporatization of politics. We've seen the end of meaningful left-right division, giving voters a real choice in elections. Blair or Cameron, what's the difference? That kind of almost corporatization of politics, frankly, hacks off many voters. We've seen, as a response to that, a huge rise in voting for what I call, the word populism I think is vague. A broader, more useful concept is insurgent parties. It covers non-Eurosceptic parties like Podemos. It also covers xenophobic parties like Jobbik in Hungary. So this is what Mayer is arguing, that elites have let people down, and we're now living in an age where deference is dead. People are much more critical of their leaders. People have access to information through the internet, through electronic means. Goodness me, it's even difficult now for a British Prime Minister to hide his tax returns. You know, we've now got to this stage of, you know, the public wanting to know. And this has had an impact on the European Union, which we must not discount. The migration crisis has accelerated this, but hasn't caused it. Now, the response, obviously, researching this problem, this issue, the response of the elites in Brussels is an interesting one. When I've contacted the Commission President's office and when I talked to Donald Tusk once about this, he said it's a little local difficulty. Look at the 2014 election results for the European Parliament. At most, 86 MEPs out of 750 elected from these so-called insurgent parties. Merely 11.45% of the vote. No danger. Nothing to see here. Move along, please. I think that's a very complacent view. When I did my research on the sort of people who are attracted to these parties in the UK, what I found was that many of them weren't racists, they weren't xenophobes, they were people who I described as suffering from cultural anxiety. Who are we? Do we have a country anymore? Are there borders? Does the national flag mean anything? Those sorts of people can be easily suborned and seduced to vote for far-right or even populist insurgent parties. And the complacency of elites, that there's nothing much to be worried about, I think is worrying. This is one of the problems that Peter Mayer says about the European Union itself. This is a bit like Camelot. There are gilded princes living on a different plane from everybody else who are not really plugged in to the sorts of problems that are happening out there in the real world. One final point about this so-called insurgency crisis. When I looked at the number of people who didn't vote in the European elections, barely 40% of citizens vote. The 60% that stay at home, when they are asked, is it because you are simply happy with things as they are? There's no point in exercising a vote, you know, because it's the old permissive consensus argument that Helen Wallace uses. Everybody's more or less content, so why bother getting up on a wet Saturday or Sunday going to the polling station? When you look at the abstention rates, certainly in the United Kingdom, I find that there are large numbers of people who are on the edge of insurgency. They still claim that they have liberal values, but they're attracted to the UKIP's and the British National Party and all of these other sort of parties that peddle national, atavistic, and rather narrow-minded ideological views. If those abstentions were converted, and it's not too far from being anxious to turning that into a vote for anxiety-led politics, if they were to be turned into votes for Euroscepticism, then the European Union would have a much greater problem on its hands than it has at the moment. So this raises a question that I want to come back to at the end of the paper, but I will just mention now. This crisis of reconnecting with citizens, reconnecting not just with the idea of a liberal politics, but with the European idea itself, has to be addressed by the elites themselves. The polls show constantly that there is massive public discontent with the way that the European Union and national governments and national political institutions operate. So my conclusion from this challenge is we need to revisit the European idea, we need to reimagine it, we need to revise the way it is implemented through its processes and political institutions. And I will suggest at the end of this paper just a few ideas. There's a massive literature on this, obviously, but just a few ideas about how we might do that. Fourthly, the fourth challenge. You would have had to have been Rip Van Winkle, asleep for 100 years, not to realize that Europe has had a major problem with terrorism. The challenge of security. National security and European-wide security are the same thing. Terrorists don't recognize borders. We saw the facility with which Islamic terrorists crossed from Paris to Brussels and back again, and the way that these networks work in real contempt for the idea of national borders. And it seems to me that this terrorism challenge, and I'm not trying to be melodramatic here, the fact that large numbers of law-abiding, decent French kids got killed at the Bataclan, or people, I used to travel, my partner lived and worked in Brussels. We used to get that metro train at about that time every morning. We could have been on that train if we were not now living in the United Kingdom. So this is not a sort of faux crisis or a faux challenge. It's a serious issue, and it has two dimensions. Firstly, when we look at the crisis, there is a kind of easy view that, well, all these terrorists came in with the migrants from Syria. They didn't. We had bombings in London in 2005. There were bombings in Madrid. There have been bombings in Paris twice, murders and assassinations, latterly in Brussels. These are our young Muslim citizens. These are second and third generation of disaffected youth. This is homegrown, not imported terrorism. It's based on a sense of alienation, it's based on anger, it's based on a perception of cultural difference. They are Islamo-fascists and nihilists, but nevertheless, they have issues that the European Union and its policymakers, nationally and at the EU level, have largely failed to address. We have been obsessed with the minutiae of budgetary restraints, or the Grexit, the Greek financial crisis. These are all important things, but not to the exclusion of equally important things with the potential for damaging and undermining the European Union. Bernard-Henri Lévy said in that BBC lecture, I hope you get a chance to look at it on YouTube, I think it is on YouTube. He says that we have a generation of young people who live in our European cities who hate our values. He used the word metrocide. They're not just attacking Christianity. They're attacking urban life, urban values, all the things associated with liberal politics. And he said, we have to find an answer to that. An answer at the national and at the European Union level. We've had two models, haven't we, of dealing with disaffected third and second generation migrants. We assimilate them, the French view, the universalist view, or the British view of multiculturalism. Neither of those two models is working. The European Union needs to use some of its talents, the people in the policy processes, some of its academics, to try and find a post-national model of integrating for the first time third country nationals. We had a great opportunity at the time of the European Constitution. I wrote a book, a major book, on the struggle for the European Constitution. And what I found in that whole debate about citizenship and democracy was a real lack of interest by the people on the European Constitutional Convention. They were much more concerned with how many commissioners, what sort of voting strength should Germany have. They didn't address the sort of civil society issues that are essential to solving this problem. We could have developed a concept of EU. I'm sure you know that EU citizenship does not apply to third country nationals. You only get it if you have a passport of a member state. There are 14 million, at least, third country nationals living and working legally in the European Union. Many of those people feel, whether it's in the French banlieue or whether it's in the ghettos of northern England, places like Bradford and Oldham, many of those young people feel, unlike their parents and grandparents, who are just glad to have got the chance to settle in the UK, they feel we've been here, we were born here, yet we are somehow neglected, we are somehow discriminated against in terms of educational opportunities or jobs and so on. So that's the first question, I think, of this particular challenge, the security challenge. The second aspect of it is the obvious one. Leaving aside the sort of sociological dimension, the transnational challenge of terrorism is also about security. An article in the Financial Times a few weeks ago said, Peter Spiegel again, there is a strong sense amongst the public in today's European Union that they are not safe. Something I would never have admitted to. You know, I lived in Brussels, or I commuted to Brussels, and, you know, for 7 or 8 years. I never felt in danger. Even London in 2005, we thought this is a one-off. You know, you'd have to be very unlucky to be on the wrong bus or the wrong tube train. There is now a growing sense amongst many people that, you know, you just never know. You can't take it for granted that you are not going to be threatened by some violent act. And this means, of course, that the European Union has to improve the way that it deals with terrorism. André Damso, who is a Belgium MEP, belongs to the ALDE Liberal bloc, said that the security issue in Europe has been a disaster, that we have failed to implement the most basic forms of intelligence sharing. He talked about the helicopter view, where you take an overview of the threat and the intelligence is shared amongst all of the member states. There was a reticence, he said, in the European Parliament's debate on this, even for friendly nations like France and Germany, to share basic intelligence information. This is something that I think the European Union has to address. We need, I'm not arguing for a European security community, I'm not arguing for a European police force. These sorts of federalist ideas probably wouldn't work, but just a willingness to cooperate more closely and share intelligence. We have a better relationship with the USA in the UK in terms of sharing intelligence with the CIA than we do with many of our fellow members of the European community, the European Union. This is a major challenge, and again, something to be left on the table for our politicians to address. And finally, let me come to, you know, the elephant in the room, as Natalie Klein once said, Brexit. Will Britain really leave the European Union? Let's look at the, if you like, the kind of pessimistic view. There are people around Europe who say they've never really been part of it anyway. They were latecomers to the feast. They turned down the chance at the very beginning to be a major player in the coal and steel community. The Brits are exceptionalists. They really are American Trojan horses. Nothing much to be gained whether they stay or leave. And, you know, one can understand. I'm speaking as somebody who is working as hard as I can for the Stay campaign in the UK. One can understand our European allies and colleagues taking that point of view. We have not been good Europeans. We have tended, from Mrs. Thatcher even through to Tony Blair, to talk about red lines, our money, our national interests. There are people in the European Union itself who say, no real challenge here. I heard a German journalist, very entertaining guy on BBC Newsnight a couple of weeks ago saying, in Germany we have a phrase, extrawurst. all the Brits wanted was a bit more sausage. You know, once you give them a few more concessions, the so-called basket of four, you know, a bit of control over benefits and visa applications, and the British will be happy. But I think that the challenge is a bit more serious than that. I'm closer to this debate than many of you. And not from an academic point of view. I actually, you know, put on my overcoat and go out on a Saturday morning to the local shopping centres and try and persuade people that it's worth staying in the European Union. There is, I think, well, how shall I put it? There is a kind of view that it's going to be very close. Remember the Duke of Wellington after the Battle of Waterloo? It was a damn close-run thing. We forget, don't we, that it was the Germans who saved us that day. And it was the Prussians who arrived with Marshal Blucher who made sure that Napoleon was defeated. Otherwise, we'd all be speaking French, I guess, in the UK by now. That's just a joke, by the way. But anyway, I think that it's going to be very close. And I think that it isn't really like the Scottish referendum at all. I'm too polite to correct comments that were made from the stage in earlier presentations about the Scots want to leave. Hello, we had the referendum, people voted to stay, and by a large majority of about 10%. The SNP keep bleating on about more referendums. We call it the never-endum, not the referendum. You keep asking the question until you get the right answer. But most Scots people know that the price of oil now means that Scotland would be unsustainable. Its economy would dive with a huge black hole of billions of pounds, or whatever currency the Scots would use if they had independence. That's not the issue. Scotland is safe. But Britain in the European Union is more problematic. And I think it's important. Anything we did about Scotland wasn't going to influence the rest of you. What we decide to do over the EU could well influence the rest of you. I saw an opinion poll in a Dutch journal called De Hond, which found that 53% of Dutch people polled want their own referendum on EU membership. Of the people who said they would vote in that referendum, 44% said they would vote to stay, 43% said they would vote to leave. Now, one of the fears I have, and it's a fear that's been expressed by a number of people around the EU, is that if Britain does leave, this will give a huge boost to Exiters and Eurosceptics in other European countries. It might start a rush. Not everybody would want to leave, but the problems that the European Union, the challenges the European Union is facing, might well be accelerated by a British exit. What will happen? Your guess is as good as mine. I thought I'd predicted the result of the British general election, and I was wrong. So were the opinion posters. The opinion posters are saying it's almost 50-50. But one of my colleagues who teaches in the economics department, who is an expert on probabilities, tells me that don't talk to academics or experts or opinion posters about what's going to happen in politics. Talk to these people who organize markets for betting on horse racing. We call them bookmakers or turf accountants. In Britain, you can't get decent odds on Britain leaving. All these turf accountants are saying that the stay-in camp will win by, not by a huge amount, but by a significant amount. But that doesn't mean to say we have to be complacent. The case has still got to be made. Some of the problems in this campaign at the moment are British political leaders. We have a Prime Minister, David Cameron, I'm sure you know, who is widely mistrusted even by his own voters. His own party is split from top to bottom on Europe. He's already announced that he's going to retire from politics before the next election. He's already looking at how he can book all those expensive lecture tours and make lots of money when he becomes the next Prime Minister. He's not really making the case for staying, and the Labour Party, led by, I'm sure you know, we have this rather sort of elderly gentleman called Jeremy Corbyn. The Labour Party is completely absent from the debate. A party that should be making the debate on behalf of Britain staying in is at the best equivocal, and at worst, some of its leading members are saying we might not be better leaving the European Union after all. So the jury is out on British exit. And it's certainly a challenge that if we do decide in Britain to leave the European Union, that will have a significant knock-on effect. You think of the consequences. Had Scotland left the UK, we would have been diminished. Would we have kept our seat on the Security Council? Would we have had the same kind of heft and influence in Washington? Absolutely not. We would have been damaged in every way. And I think that the European Union, those people who rub their hands with glee and say the sooner they leave the better, I think might reflect that a European Union without the Brits on board would be a less influential place, a less influential actor in international politics. Lastly, and I don't want to spend any time on this, this is, if you like, the oldest challenge of all, is, of course, Brexit, the rolling crisis of the Eurozone. You probably know Varoufakis has just published his book. I went to a lecture he gave where he was publicising his book in London. I don't know what it is about that man. I mean, he talks a lot of sense, but he loves himself so much. I mean, one of the things about Varoufakis is that it's hard to like him because he is so super confident. But what he said about Brexit was when somebody asked him, is that crisis now finished? Has the European Union solved that? Can it put it in the out tray? Not at all, he said. We're simply recycling the debts. There will be a time not too far away when we come back for more money. And we will keep on coming back for more money because we have to recycle the debt. This is a Eurozone that was designed badly, hastily, and had all sorts of flaws. And the European Union is going to have to revisit that project big time if it's going to finally put the Greek crisis in the out tray. Okay, so they're the challenges. Do they amount to a crisis? They might do. One of the problems I've found about European politicians is their over-enthusiasm for hubris. Everything's fine. You talk to Juncker or you listen to Juncker. I've talked to Donald Tusk. Don't worry about it. Everything will be okay on the night. In fact, we've got a European Union that was never designed to sustain multiple shocks or multiple challenges of the sort that it's now facing. Secondly, one of the things I find most infuriating as a committed European is the pretense at solutions. Brexit solved. No, it wasn't. Migration solved. No, it isn't. Don't worry about insurgent parties because nobody votes for them. But they might do in the future. If the Brits leave, everything will... I heard an Italian former finance minister saying, no problem if the Brits leave. You know, they never really were committed Europeans anyway. I think a lot of people, more sensible commentators in Europe would say, well, there will be problems. Certainly for Britain. There's no great nirvana out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where we can sail off after we... There are people in Nigel Farage who thinks that all we have to do is get a ship big enough and tow the British Isles across the Atlantic and park them off the coast of Florida and we'll get honorary status of the 51st state. The Americans aren't interested. If the Americans are interested in Europe, they're interested in Europe through the lens of Germany, not through the lens of the United Kingdom. So, institutions that are stretched, badly designed, politicians in denial, and multiple centrifugal forces at work. Let me just quote. I'm not somebody who normally quotes Varoufakis, and I've had all sorts of reservations about his role in the European crisis over the last, agent provocateur springs to mind over the last 5 years. But in his book, he says this: the European Union has become a terribly unstable environment which will disintegrate even if a small depressed country like Greece leaves it, let alone a major economy like Britain. Now, what he was saying in the chapter in the book that refers to that is that if Britain leaves, it will be a crisis of unprecedented proportions, that we can only imagine what the solutions might be. Okay, I promise you at the beginning of the paper, and it will have to be, I'm sure I'm running over time here, but I promise you some kind of prognosis of how we might resolve the crisis. My view of the European Union is that it lacks fundamental legitimacy. We all know, we've read all the textbooks, Helen Wallace, Neil Nugent and the rest, who say that the European Union never was really concerned about democracy. It didn't need to be. It had bigger things to think about. It had to reconcile France and Germany, rebuild the European economy. create cooperation on all sorts of levels that had destroyed it when those levels of cooperation were missing in the 1930s. It was a kind of top-down approach, a kind of elitist approach based on the assumption that you don't really have to tell the people what's going on. They don't really understand anyway. Experts know best. Helen Wallace summarized that view very well with her concept, permissive consensus. Legitimacy was based on performance. And by God, it worked. You know, as I said right at the beginning, all those achievements at the credit, or to the credit of the European project. But it never really moved away from that kind of elitist. Monnet was a great man, but he was not instinctively or instinctually a Democrat. Our present Commission President, Juncker, at the time when he was running the Eurozone group, when he was asked by journalists, why don't you tell the public about these problems? Oh, the public they don't know anything. They don't understand anyway. Pascal Lamy, at the time of the Maastricht vote, when Danes voted no, when he was the chef de cabinet of Jacques Delors, the Danes had voted no. Is that a problem? No, he said. We'll just keep asking the question until they give us the right answer. These are real problems, I think, that the European Union faces, and it lacks that kind of legitimacy, that base of legitimacy that it had. When that generation after the war saw the achievements in the space of 10 years, you know, from the surrender of the German army to the establishment of the committee that led to what we called the European Economic Community. It was monumental. We're not living in that age now. That generation's dead. We're now living in an age where young people are much more skeptical, much more cynical. We really have to work hard to convince young people in Europe that the European Union is on their side. And what do we see? We see a Europe where, and this is an old hackneyed phrase, but democracy deficits are the name of the game. Marty Feldstein wrote that brilliant paper in Foreign Affairs in 1997 at the time of the launch of the Eurozone. He said, it won't work because it isn't underpinned by public and popular legitimacy. It's an elite project. It has ignored the people, and you can't ignore the people when you're expecting them to support a major project where currency and savings and income are involved. Vernon Bognador, who I knew well, he was, of course, the Gladstone professor. David Cameron's tutor at Oxford, he taught David Cameron politics. Gladstone professor of politics at Oxford. He said, in a paper I once attended, he gave in a conference in London, if the European Union were applying to join itself, it wouldn't get in because it's not democratic enough. Schumpeter, you know, the great Jewish emigre from Austria who finished up teaching politics at Cambridge. The minimum requirement of any polity that pretends to be democratic is you get the chance to kick the rascals out. We can't kick the rascals out in the European Union. And don't quote me the Spitzenkandidaten procedure, because this was, as I see it, was a kind of constitutional coup by the European Parliament. That reading of Article 17, subsection 7, that said, taking into account the views of the European Parliament, was interpreted by the Parliament rather differently to the way it was interpreted by the people who signed the Lisbon Treaty. And Mrs. Merkel, because she had other things to think about, eventually said, when other member states protested, look, the Parliament can't choose. At the moment, we select names and they approve. So that was not an exercise in democratic insurgency. As I keep saying, I didn't even know that the hustings were on. You know, every party selected its own candidate. I was flicking the channels, and I frequently BBC Parliament channel. And all of a sudden, the debates in the European Parliament by the candidates were taking place. Now, I'm pretty tuned into what's going on in the European Union. And I didn't know those debates were taking place. What chance have ordinary citizens got to listen to the manifestos of their candidates? And certainly when it came to the ballot paper, there was no name, there was no box on the ballot paper that said, after you've elected your 4 MEPs, these are the candidates for office of Commission President. But this kind of blithe misuse of words like democracy, I think, is something that has to be addressed. I'll finish with a quote from Joseph Weiler, who I've got a great deal of time for. I mean, he's a radical federalist, but one with a huge amount of common sense. He doesn't think that you can wave magic wands and turn Europe into a federal democracy overnight. But he says, in a recent paper that he wrote, the two most important norms of democracy, the principles of accountability and the principles of representation, are compromised by the very process and structure of the European Union. Now, what he was saying in that paper is that we need to revisit the project, redesign it. There is a case for electing Commission and Council President. There is a case for electing the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. At the moment, these are jobs that go round the Brussels circle and are appointed by leading members of the inner circle. What Joseph Weiler was saying there was that we need to reconnect with the people. He also said this, and this is my final point. We don't do this, he said, by some federalist fantasy. There is no European demos, there is no European identity, there is at the moment no European people. The repository of meaningful legitimacy in Europe stays with the nation states. He says that the European Union has to work with its nation states. This is where the ballast of legitimacy remains. There is no European level of legitimacy. There never has been. It's not designed to be a project that deals in popular legitimacy. And what Joseph Weiler says in that article is that the European Union has to, in a sense, invert. Some of you may have read Alan Millward, the great historian of the European coal and steel community. One of the last books he wrote with Romero was the European rescue of the nation state. Weiler says we need to turn that round. European nation states may need to rescue Europe. We may need to invert that connection. So I'm not arguing, and he's not arguing for razor wire and inviolable borders. Nobody is certainly arguing on this side of the debate for xenophobia. What we're saying is the nation states are still important actors. The nation states have to provide the legitimacy, and the European Union then has to provide the leadership and the ideas and the inspiration in conjunction with member states that will resolve these separate challenges and prevent them from becoming a terminal crisis. Can I just quote, before I finish, can I just quote again from William Shakespeare, since I started with him. He makes Brutus say in Julius Caesar this: there is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. And we must take the current when it serves. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures. Put into more prosaic and contemporary English, what Shakespeare is saying there is that politics as life is contingent. We make it ourselves. It's not driven by teleology or by ideology. It's not determined ideologically. We make our own history. Nothing is written. We have to write it ourselves. The idea of Europe is not a destiny waiting to happen. We just lie in bed and one day we'll wake up in a United States of Europe. This ever closer union mantra rather, I think, diminishes the need for working for a better European Union. Remember Scheingold and Lindbergh, the great neo-functionalists? What spills over can also spill back. What integrates can also disintegrate. What we need, therefore, is leadership, political imagination, the sort of vision and spirit the Founding Fathers brought to the project in those early days of destruction and cataclysm in 1945. Oh, for political leaders with that kind of vision now. Thank you.